This is section 4.1 for micro. We're going to do an introduction on resource markets, look at MRP, MRC, and profit maximization. So here are the objectives. You can look at them. Essentially what we're going to look at how product and resource markets are different, look at the roles for each, look at new terms, marginal revenue product and marginal resource costs, and look at the profit maximizing rule for resources at which MRP is equal to MRC. So earlier we looked at product markets. We looked at the supply and demand for goods and services. In the product market, you look for the supply and demand of goods and services. Now we are looking at resource markets. You'll also see them called factor markets. It's like product markets, but instead of looking at supply and demand for goods and services, we are looking for supply and demand for resources such as land, labor, and capital. So if you remember, here is the circular flow of economic activity, and you can see where the resource market is. It is in the middle, and you can see that on the resource market, firms will demand resources, households supply resources. So just as a recap, in product markets, households were the demanders, firms were the suppliers. In resource markets, firms are now demanding resources from the households who are now the suppliers. Now, it turns out the laws of supply and demand still hold true even in resource markets, just as they did in product markets. There's no difference. The demand curve is still downward sloping. The supply curve is still upward sloping. If I'm going too fast, you can pause and restart whenever you're ready to go. So here's some big ideas about resource or factor markets. Again, resource markets, factor markets, interchangeable terms, resources and factors. The economic concepts are similar to those for product markets. The demand for a resource of production is derived from the demand for the good or service produced from this resource. We'll look at derived demand tomorrow. So the demand for resource of production is derived from the demand for the good or service. In other words, the demand for resources depends or comes from the demand for the good or services. If the demand for the good goes up, the demand for resources to make that good is also going to go up. Number 3, a firm tries to hire additional units of a resource up to the point where the resource's marginal revenue product, MRP, is equal to its marginal resource cost, MRC. So MRP, MRC are new terms. We'll look at those shortly. Number 4, in hiring labor, a perfectly competitive firm will do best if it hires up to the point where MRP equals the wage rate. Wages are equal to MRC if the labor market is perfectly competitive. So we'll look at perfectly competitive labor markets. We'll also look at imperfectly competitive labor markets. But essentially, you are going to hire workers until the wages equal MRC. The MRP equals the wage rate. Okay. Number 5, from a worker standpoint, if you want a high wage, make something people will pay a lot for. So people pay a lot for stupid things like electronic games or various trinkets. For a while it was fidget spinners. People would pay a lot of money for it. Work for a highly productive firm, and that's where Silicon Valley firms are very productive, and we'll look at productivity. Essentially, it means revenue or product per worker. And be in relatively short supply. So if you are doing a job that's not very well populated, like a brain surgeon, that's going to make it easier for you to make a higher wage compared to someone that does a job that many people can do, like clerical work. Invest in your human capital. That basically means get trained, get an education. Number 6, real wages depend on productivity. So in other words, how productive you are means how much you get paid. Productivity, number 7, depends on real or physical capital, human capital, labor quality, and technology. So we looked at that in terms of shifters of supply. All those things will help shift supply. All right, so for resource markets, we are going to primarily focus our analysis on human labor as a resource. And that's because you can hire as many workers as you want, readily available workers. So you could do the same thing if you're looking at physical capital or land. You can do the same sort of analysis, but we're going to look at human labor specifically as our resource. So we're going to define a couple terms here. MRC, and this is on number 1 of page 4-2, marginal resource cost is the additional cost for each additional worker or other input. So in other words, how much more money do you got to pay to hire this additional worker? It's sometimes called MFC for marginal factor cost. So again, MRC, how much more money does a firm have to pay to hire an additional worker? Why is MRC the same as supply? If a worker wants to work, they must offer their services at the wage set by the market. So MRC in a perfectly competitive market is constant because the firm can hire as many workers as it wants at the wage set by the market. So we'll look at this when we get to our simulation tomorrow. We're not going to be able to do it today because I'm not here. So this is the answer number 3 and number 4 on page 4-2. Okay, so working in a perfectly competitive market where MRC is constant. So this is the formal definition for MRC. It's the change in total cost divided by the change in labor, assuming labor is the only cost. All right, now demand for labor, that's the other side. The firm's demand for workers depends on how profitable each worker is. How can we determine how much each worker is worth to a firm? Well, let's think of it this way. If a worker generates 5 additional units of output that can be sold for $10 each, how much is that or he worth to the firm? Since the worker generated an additional $50 in revenue, the firm will profit so long as they pay him a wage less than $50 because he generated $50 of additional revenue. So as long as they pay him less than $50 to work to generate that $50, they would hire him. So the demand for each worker equals what we call the marginal revenue product, or MRP. MRP is the additional revenue generated by an additional worker. So if you hired this additional worker, he produces more output. That output can be sold for revenue. How much more revenue does hiring that additional worker generate for your company? Now, in perfectly competitive markets, MRP is equal to MP times P. In other words, MRP is equal to the marginal product times the price of the product. So remember, in a perfectly competitive product market, you can sell as many units as you want for the same price. For example, if the marginal product of the third worker is 5 units and the price of the good is constant at $20, the MRP is 5 times 20 or $100. In other words, that worker can produce 5 more units, sell them for $20 each. He generates another $100 for his company. Additional revenue for that worker is $100. So here's the definition for MRP. It's a change in total revenue divided by the change in labor. All right, so we're going to skip ahead to the example on page 4-4. We'll do the simulation in class tomorrow. So let's give this example. You and your partner own a business. Assume you and your partner are selling the goods in a perfectly competitive product market, so the price is constant at $10. Let's also assume you are hiring workers in a perfectly competitive labor market. We'll look at these terms a little more in depth as the week goes on. So the wage is constant at $15. What this means is you can hire as many workers as you want for $15 per worker. Let's also assume that wage is the only cost for your firm. And to maximize profit, the question is, how many workers should you hire? So here is the chart. So you have units of labor, total product output. I want you guys to complete the first 2 columns of the chart, MP and product price. Pause the video and come back when you're done. All right, so how much is each worker worth to the firm? Well, you want to ask these questions. What's happening to total product? Why does this occur? And where are the 3 stages of production? Remember, increasing returns, diminishing returns, and negative returns. So next, let's look at marginal product. Marginal product is the additional product generated by each additional worker hired. So you see that the additional product going from 0 to 1 is 7 additional units, 1 to 2 is 10 additional units, and so on and so forth. This shows the productivity of each worker. In other words, this worker contributes MP to the total product. So you're not looking at average productivity from a company standpoint. You're really wanting to know, if I hire this additional worker, how much more product will be able to produce. So this shows the productivity of each worker. Next, we have the product price. The price is constant. It's $10 per unit. So this price is constant because we are in a perfectly competitive product market, right? So now what I want you to do is calculate MRP by taking the marginal product and multiplying it by the product price, since we're in a perfectly competitive labor market and a perfectly competitive product market. So here is price, average additional revenue per worker, or MRP. So you're going to take the marginal product, 7 times the price, $10. So you see how much additional revenue each worker generates for the company. And you see it goes from 70 to 100, then down to 70, all the way eventually to that 7th worker, which actually loses $30 for the company. This column shows how much more each worker is worth in terms of revenue to the firm. So MRP in a perfectly competitive product and labor market is equal to price times marginal product. If you don't remember the rules, don't worry, we'll go over them the next few days. So how many workers are you going to hire? Well, that raises the question of MRC. This is the additional cost for each worker. Now we're told we can hire as many workers as we want for $15 a worker. So a firm is going to keep hiring workers so long as the MRP is greater than MRC. And we'll look at this more in depth when we do our simulation. So in other words, a firm is going to keep hiring people so long as that worker generates more money than he costs. All right? So notice for the fifth worker, that fifth worker still generates $20 for the company, but only costs $15. So you're going to hire that worker. However, for the sixth worker, you are not going to hire him because he's going to only generate $10 in additional revenue, but cost the firm $15. Okay, so you're going to keep hiring until your marginal revenue product equals your marginal resource cost. In this case, you're not going to ever pay more to hire a worker than you will from the revenue he or she generates. So you can look at total profit. Total profit is $55 for 1 unit. Remember, it's the only cost is labor, so you're going to basically multiply profit units of labor times cost. Okay, so here's your total profit. You see that the total profit is maximized at the fifth worker. Okay, so for your assignment, I would like you to work on activity 4.1 part A, numbers 1 through 10, and be ready to go through it on Thursday. We will also have an activity that illustrates why MRP equals MRC.